Hello, welcome to another episode of Story Time with Uncle Monkey. I am your Uncle Monkey, and today's story is Little Briar Rose, also known as Sleeping Beauty. In days of old, there lived a king and queen who said every day,
Oh, if only we had a child.
but they never had one. Then it so happened, when the queen was once sitting in her bath, that a frog crept out of the water onto dry land and said to her,
Your wish will be granted. Before a year is over, you shall give birth to a daughter.
what the frog predicted came to pass, and the queen bore a girl who was so beautiful that the king was beside himself with joy and had a huge party. He invited not merely his relatives, friends, and acquaintances, but also the wise women so that they could be favorably inclined towards the child. There were 13 of them in his kingdom, but because he only had 12 golden plates for them to eat off of, one of them had to stay home. The feast was celebrated with great splendor, and when it was over, the wise women gave wondrous gifts to the child. One of them gave virtue, the second, beauty, the third, wealth, and so on, until the girl was endowed with everything desirable in life. Right after the 11th wise woman had spoken her charm, the 13th suddenly burst in. She wanted to take revenge for not being invited, and without greeting or even looking at anyone, she called out loudly, "In her 15th year, the princess shall prick her finger on a spindle and shall fall down dead." And without saying another word, she turned on her heel and left the hall. Everyone was alarmed, but then the 12th wise woman stepped forward. She had yet to express her wish, and because she couldn't undo the evil charm, but only soften it, she said, "The princess shall not die, but shall fall into a deep sleep that lasts for 100 years." The king, who dearly wanted to protect his beloved child from that misfortune, issued a command that all spindles in the whole kingdom were to be burned. But all the gifts made to the girl by the wise women came into effect, for she was beautiful, well-behaved, friendly, intelligent, so much so that everyone who saw her had to love her. It came about that on the day that she turned 15, the king and queen weren't home, and the girl was left all alone in the palace. So she walked all over, inspecting the rooms and chambers just as she pleased, until she finally came to an ancient tower. She climbed the narrow spiral staircase and found herself in front of a small door. A rusty key was in the lock, and when she turned it, the door flew open. And there, in a tiny room, sat an old lady with a spindle, diligently spinning her flax. "Good day, sweet old lady," said the princess. "What's that you're doing?" "I'm spinning," said the old woman, nodding her head. "What sort of thing is that that's dancing about so merrily?" asked the girl, pointing at the spindle. She took the spindle and wanted to do some spinning herself, but scarcely had she touched the spindle when the magic charm took effect and she pricked her finger with it. And at that very moment she felt the smart on her finger. She dropped onto the bed and was already in the room and was already fast asleep. And that sleep spread through the whole palace. The king and queen, who had just arrived home and entered the great hall, began to doze off, and all the courtiers with them. Then the horses in the stable were also asleep, as well as the dogs in the courtyard, the pigeons on the roof, and the flies on the wall. Yes, even the fire that was flickering on the hearth became still and fell asleep, and the roast stopped sizzling, and the cook, who was just about to pull the kitchen boy's hair because he had neglected something, let him go and went to sleep. And the wind died down, and the trees in front of the palace, not a leaf was stirring any more. And all around the palace a thorn hedge began to grow, becoming taller every year until finally it was so big it encircled the whole palace and grew out beyond it, so that nothing more could be seen of it, not even the banner on the roof. But a legend passed throughout the land about the beautiful sleeping Little Briar Rose, for that was the name of the princess. So that from time to time princes came and tried to make their way through the hedge to the palace to save her. But they couldn't do it because the thorns clung together closely as if they had hands, and the young men were left hanging there. They couldn't get loose again and died a miserable death. Many, many years later, a prince entered the land once more and heard an old man telling a story about the thorn hedge. There was said to be a palace behind it in which miraculously beautiful princess named Little Briar Rose had been sleeping for 100 years now. And along with her, the king and the queen and all the courtiers were sleeping. He had also heard from his grandfather that many princes had tried already to penetrate the thorn hedge, and all that remained of them were their bodies hanging because they had died an unhappy death. Then the young man said,
I'm not afraid. I'll go there and I'll see the beautiful Little Briar Rose.
The kind old man tried to dissuade him, but the prince wouldn't listen to him. Now the 100 years were just over, and the day had come on which Little Briar Rose was to wake up again. When the prince approached the thorn hedge, it was nothing but big, beautiful flowers that separated of their own will and let him through unharmed, closing again behind him like a hedge. In the palace yard he saw the horses and spotted hunted dogs lying in slumber. On the roof sat the pigeons with their heads tucked under their wings. When he entered the building, the flies were asleep on the wall, and the cook in the kitchen still held out his hand as if about to seize the boy. And the maid was sitting in front of the black chicken that had to be plucked. Then he walked on, and in the great hall he saw all the courtiers lying on the ground, asleep, and up near the throne lie the king and queen. Then he walked further still, and everything was so quiet that you could hear your own breathing. Finally, he reached the tower and opened the door to the small room in which Little Briar Rose was sleeping. There she lay. She was so beautiful that he couldn't take his eyes off her. He leaned over and gave her a kiss. The moment he touched her with his kiss, Little Briar Rose opened her eyes, awoke, and gave him a most friendly glance. Then they went downstairs together, and the king awoke, as did the queen and all the courtiers, and they all looked at one another with staring eyes. And the horses in the courtyard stood up and shook themselves. The hunting hounds jumped and wagged their tails. The pigeons on the roof drew their heads from under their wings, looked around, and flew into the countryside. The flies on the wall went on crawling. The fire in the kitchen flared up, flickered, and cooked the food. The roast began sizzling again, and the cook boxed the boy's ear so hard that he yelled. And the maid finished plucking the chicken. And then the wedding of the prince and Little Briar Rose was celebrated with great splendor, and they lived happily ever after for the rest of their days. The end.